So today, we're diving into one of the most intense contracts you'll ever find, literally carved in stone. It's right there in the biblical book of Deuteronomy, and it's this huge national covenant with some seriously high stakes. We're talking amazing blessings for obedience and catastrophic curses for rebellion. Let's get into it.
Just imagine you're Moses for a second. You've led your people for 40 years, and you're about to hand over the reins. How do you make sure the values you've instilled actually stick? How do you forge a promise so powerful that it's going to echo down through the generations? Well, the solution we find in Deuteronomy is part legal document, part national ceremony, and part prophecy. Okay, so to really get what's happening in Deuteronomy, you first have to understand this ancient political tool, the suzerain vassal treaty. Think of it like a high-stakes contract from the ancient world. You have a powerful king, the suzerain, who lays out all the rules. If the lesser state, the vassal, plays by those rules, they get protection, prosperity, the whole deal. But if they rebel, the consequences are absolutely dire. This is the exact framework for Deuteronomy, with God as the suzerain and the nation of Israel as the vassal.
Right, so a contract this big, you can't just, sign it and stick it in a drawer. No way. It needs a huge public ceremony, something so memorable that nobody could ever forget what they agreed to. And the instructions for this ceremony are incredibly specific.
The moment they enter the promised land, bam, they're commanded to perform this ritual. First, set up these massive stones. Then, plaster them white so they really stand out, and write the entire law on them for everyone to see. It's a physical, tangible, and communal act of commitment, all sealed with a giant national party.
But why? Why all this effort? Why not just write it on a scroll, right? What's the deal with these massive plastered stones set up on a mountain?
Well, it's because here, the medium is the message. A giant inscribed monument like this is just impossible to ignore. It becomes a permanent part of the landscape, a constant physical reminder of the promise they made. This isn't just some suggestion on a scroll. These words have the enduring authority of solid stone.
And the drama of this whole ceremony, it's just incredible. It's pure theater. The entire nation is literally split in half. As you see here, half the tribes stand on Mount Gerizim, and they're shouting the blessings for obedience across the valley. And the other half, they're on Mount Ebal, shouting back the curses for disobedience. They are physically standing right between their two possible futures.
So, that sets the stage. Now let's get into the actual terms of this contract, because the stakes just could not be clearer. And this wasn't about some abstract theological idea. This was about tangible, real-world consequences. And what you'll notice right away is how everything is mirrored. The blessings and the curses are often exact opposites of each other, and they cover every single aspect of their life, from the city to the field, from their kids to their livestock. The message is painfully simple. Your choices will directly impact every single part of your existence. And get this wasn't just some private agreement. Israel was located right at the crossroads of major ancient trade routes. So their success or their failure, their blessing or their curse, it would all be a very public testimony to the surrounding nations about the kind of God they served.
But here's something really interesting. If you actually sit down and read through this, you'd notice a huge imbalance. The section that details all the curses is dramatically longer and way more detailed than the section on blessings.
So why do that? Well, it seems totally intentional. The sheer weight and, honestly, the horror of the potential curses were meant to be a powerful psychological deterrent, something to really motivate the people to remember and keep this covenant.
All right, and this is where the contract takes a really shocking turn. Seriously, because hidden in the fine print is this startling admission that the people are probably going to fail. It's just this incredible moment of foresight, where the text itself basically predicts future rebellion. The covenant is handed over with the full knowledge that the people, if they're just left to their own devices, will eventually break it.
And listen to how it describes the land if they break the deal. It's terrifying. It's compared to the legendary destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, a total and complete reversal of everything it was promised to be.
That contrast right there, it just sums up the stakes perfectly, doesn't it? The very land promised as this amazing gift, a paradise of milk and honey, could become an absolute wasteland of brimstone and salt. The blessing itself could become the curse.
But, and this is such a crucial twist, the curses weren't just about punishment. They were designed to work like cosmic warning signals, like giant red flags. When things started to go wrong, famine, disease, defeat in battle, it was supposed to trigger their memory, to make them realize they'd strayed from the covenant and that they needed to turn back.
So you might be thinking, wait,
If failure is basically predicted, is the whole thing hopeless? Well, no, not at all. Because this contract, amazingly, has a kind of escape clause. It includes a detailed path for how to get back on track.
Yeah, failure is not the final word here. The story was never meant to end with a ruined land and people in exile. The covenant totally anticipates that failure, but it also provides a clear blueprint for restoration. There's always a way back. And it lays out this three-step path that becomes like a foundational pattern for the rest of the Hebrew Bible. It's simple but powerful. First, you repent. You realize your mistake. Second, you return. You actively turn back and obey. And third, God responds by gathering and restoring his people, no matter how far they've been scattered.
But the ultimate hope here, it goes even deeper than just human action. The text promises something God himself will do, a circumcision of the heart. It's this powerful metaphor for a complete internal transformation, like divine surgery to change their very nature so they will actually want to love and obey him. This is the real solution to that predicted failure.
And so, at the end of the day, it all boils down to this one ultimate choice. The final speech lays it all out in the most fundamental terms possible, and it echoes that original choice back in the Garden of Eden. It's not just about obedience versus disobedience. It's literally life versus death, good versus evil, blessing versus curse.
So there it is. The two paths are laid out clear as day. And yet, the text itself knows that we humans are going to struggle to choose the right one. This ancient contract, carved in stone, leaves us with a question that's still so relevant. When the choice is this stark, why is it so hard to choose life?
That's all for this explainer. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.